Good afternoon and welcome to today's Academy Finance Professionals Counter Fraud event. Today's event will be presented by Stephen Graham from the Counter Fraud team. Before I hand over to Stephen, I'll run through some key points. This session is being recorded and will be shared after the event. Please use the chat function to ask questions or like a question that has already been asked. The team will try and answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you have any specific questions, please contact the team directly. And finally, we would appreciate it if you could complete the survey at the end of the session and we will put the link into the chat. So I'll now hand you over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Please feel free to move on to the next slide, Michelle. As Natalie mentioned, I'm Stephen Graham. I'm the Counter Fraud Strategic Lead at the agency. I've been in post for 15 months. My background and profession is over 28 years in counter fraud investigations, a lot of that in local government. And I wanted to set a little bit of the scene first of why we're here doing Power Hour for counter fraud. And I think during the last 15 months at my time at the agency, I think the first six months were getting in post, getting to know the team, the business, the agency, building up that trust and just observing what we do well and what we need to change. Then the following 6 months, we chatted with stakeholders, both internal and external, to really determine what our future direction, what our team purpose was, what we wanted to deliver, those priorities, and just think about how we could make a real impact to the sector. Included in that time period was my work getting to know the Academy's Working Group 1, which I'll come on to a little bit more as I go through the presentation. And from working with the Working Group 1 and listening to them from the sector, as well as some of the other stakeholders and my own passion for counter fraud, I'm hoping today is the start of us working with the sector. What I'm planning to cover is on screen. I'm going to cover a little bit about the ESFA counter fraud team. Hopefully I'm speaking to the converted, but why combating fraud is important. I want to talk a little bit about our new strategy across the agency and the pillars of those strategy, and hopefully that'll give you a little bit of thought of what you could be doing. Then the fraud landscape, what we're seeing across the agency in 22-23, what you could do to protect yourself, and then I'm going to leave you with a promise today, my promise, and hopefully we'll have time at the end, as Natalie said, for some questions. So my next slide, I thought would be useful to set out who we are and introduce you to the counter fraud team. I didn't just want to put an organogram on screen. I wanted to show really what our purpose was, what our key aims are, and a vision. And this, as I've said, was coming from talking to stakeholders and reviewing that direction of travel that we wanted to go in this financial year. So this is from April 23, so we're only 3 months into the new team, into the new direction, into our new delivery plans. Some of these aren't new. We previously at the agency strived for zero tolerance and had an anti-fraud culture. But hopefully you're aware the ESFA went through a little transformation last year, and we're a smaller agency now with 3 directorates, and the counter fraud team is part of the Finance and Provider Market Oversight Directorate. Within that directorate, we sit in the Counter Fraud and Prevention Division, which the division is made up of 4 teams. We have investigations and enforcement, who do a lot of the investigations and enforcement work, as what they say on the tin. We have a fund and risk team, who do a lot of our compliance activity, a data insight team, who look after our data and look at what we can do with that data, and then our team in the counter fraud, which is going to be the main focus today. But also happy to take any questions and talk about the excellent work of the rest of the division. When David Withy joined last year, he got the ESFA to review its purpose and priorities, which was great, as we'd already started that ourselves and understood what our team purpose was. And as you can see on the screen there, our aim is to protect and ensure that every pound spent on education and skills has the greatest possible impact, ensuring all learners can realise their potential. Our vision is on screen there. And what I wanted to kind of get across on this slide was this is where we want to increase our work with the sector and proactively support the academy sector, ultimately to protect yourselves, protect the ESFA and protect the public purse. Although we are a relatively small team, we have a mission to be an excellent counter fraud function. As with delivering fraud awareness, and my next slide, and speaking events that I do, I always like everyone to kind of understand what definitions we use when we're talking about fraud, bribery and corruption. And this slide hopefully articulates that. At the agency, we use the Fraud Act 2006 definition, depriving somebody of something by means of deceit or dishonesty. And there's three parts to that we use, which is fraud by false representation, fraud by wrongful failing to disclose, or fraud by abuse of position. Unfortunately, fraud in the education sector do fall under these categories, albeit we do use other legislation, the Computer Misuse Act, the Theft Act as other examples. When we do report fraud, though, to government, we do follow the civil test, the balance of probability, rather than the criminal test. So some of our figures are around that balance of probability rather than beyond reasonable doubt. Bribery and corruption is on screen there. They have their own definitions and legislation. And again, unfortunately, bribery and corruption do happen in our sector. So all three, fraud, bribery and corruption, are areas of concern. For me, prevention is key. It's our first line of defence. And it's 100% cheaper to prevent fraud and error than to investigate your way out of it. In January this year, we had a prevention team that sat in the agency, which moved into the counter fraud team, which has really allowed us to focus our efforts in prevention. And one of the first priorities, what we wanted to do was actually review what we meant by prevention. And as you can see on screen there, that is the ESFA definition. So prevention is anticipating fraud and error and putting them measures and controls in place that prevent or minimise fraud and error occurring in the first instance. And if there's anything today that I would stress for you to take away, it would be prevention, and make sure that you have prevent in everything that you do. So I'm hoping the next slide may be familiar, but I didn't want to assume whether you've seen this before or not. And if you have, there's no harm in a bit of a refresher. But there was an American criminologist called Donald Cressy who did a study of organised crime, criminal law and that white collar crime back in the 70s. What he did, Cressy, he interviewed 200 criminals and he studied the characteristics and factors influencing their criminal behaviour. And he came up with what's on screen there, known as the fraud triangle theory. This fraud triangle, even though that was back in the 70s, is still used today, albeit someone's now introduced the fraud pyramid, which has an extra side of capability. But I still use the fraud triangle in a lot of the work that we do. So what is the fraud triangle? What does it actually mean? Cressy concluded that there was three factors that contribute to potentially a person committing fraud. He did acknowledge that most people are fair and honest, which I find hard working in fraud for 28 years, but that's what his theory said. And what he found was that even with people who have a high ethical standard, they can still be tempted to commit crime or even execute the fraud, especially if these three factors of the fraud triangle are present. So the first one on screen is rationalisation. So rationalisation is the excuses that fraudsters give themselves to justify what they do in their actions. For us, this fact is probably the most difficult to observe and understand, especially during an investigation, and sometimes requires several interviews to understand that rationalisation. It's probably the hardest part of the triangle, as it's down to the fraudster's thinking rather than anything we can really control and do. And so I think the only thing that we try to do there is influence behaviour, which I guess could change people's thinking. Some of the things we hear at the sector and hear back in the agency on the rationalisation is, oh, it's just temporary, I'll pay it back. No one's really going to get hurt, it's just government money. Everyone does it, so why shouldn't I? And I actually deserve it because I've been doing well. And when we interview and when we talk to fraudsters, that's some of the things they tell us when we ask them why. The next one is pressure. Pressure can come from multiple directions. It can be the driving force really behind someone committing fraud. Sometimes the fraud triangle in other kind of publications has motivation instead of pressure, but they really mean the same thing and go hand in hand. Pressure, what we find, can sometimes come from the desire for better compensation or promotion. Maybe people have unrealistic goals or targets. People have personal financial problems, which, if you think about the cost of living crisis that we all facing at the moment, unfavourable relationships with a company, with management, may give us that pressure. It may give the pressure for the corruption and bribery element. Might be a fear of one losing his job, fear of breaking bad news, so therefore people hide the truth. And over the 28 years, one of the common things I find is simply greed. People's just greedy and want to commit fraud. When investigating fraud, it is necessary to understand and explore them pressure factors, as it usually gives us a motive of the illegal acts and why a person's kind of done that as well. And then the final factor is opportunity. Opportunity is that chance. It's the opportunity for that, the knowledge or the possibility someone has to commit fraud. Some circumstances that will influence these opportunities are the usual: missing or ineffective controls, lack of oversight, inadequate segregation of duties, or basically a poor tone from the top. Again, opportunities can be one-off or they can be multiple, and it is usually the fraud triangle that we can control, and it's an important part of what I would say is our prevention agenda at the ESFA. There was another study that isn't on screen, which was called the 10-80-10 rule, which is something that, again, I really like as well. And what it said is that 10% of actually people, probably all the people on this call, won't commit fraud, no matter what. There's 80% of people, given the right combination of maybe it's the triangle, who could commit fraud. And then there's 10% of people who are actively looking to commit frauds or make it a living of the organised crime and so forth. So what that study really gets us to do at the agency is really we want to deal with the 80%, the majority, and make sure that they don't have those factors and they don't have the temptation to commit fraud and influence the behaviour. And then the 10% people who are committing fraud, we want to kind of get out there and detect them and look at our redress and punishment. The next slide is what's known as the public sector fraud iceberg. Again, this has been around for a little while, so you may, or hopefully you've seen this. And what it's been done, it's been designed from central government to help us show the scale of the loss in central government. It shows what we know about our fraud loss, but also what we don't know. At the moment, the government estimated some recent publication that £33 billion of public sector money is lost to fraud and error each year. Staggering amounts. Just think what we could be doing with that money, especially in the current climate. The iceberg on screen is from the 2020s. We are waiting on a more updated measurement. But as you can see, just back in 2020, some staggering amounts that in £10.8 billion was detected. A lot of that was in the welfare system and HMRC. There's an estimate amount, which is below the waterline there, which equated to £30.3 billion. This is based on methodology that would have gone out the door had we not stopped it, had we not shut the door and found the fraud. And then for me, which is always an interesting one, is the unknown amount right at the bottom there. And this amounted to, as you can see, 2.9 to £28.5 billion. But what's more than that is the estimate what government is saying is that 0.5 to 5% of expenditure is unknown and they believe will be lost to fraud. Just think about that 5% or the 0.5% and your expenditure across your organisations. What impact would that have? What could you do with that money? You know, and especially in this current climate as well. As you can see from the iceberg, the majority does go undetected and is below the surface, hence the hidden crime. And what we want to start to do across the agency and across government is find more fraud and error and basically start to lift that iceberg out of the water and become better. What we see in the message today is finding fraud is actually a good thing. It helps organisations to accept and acknowledge fraud. It helps us to understand it. You know, so we say that finding fraud is a good thing. To fight it, we need to find it, and that's in our strategy, which I'll come on to in a bit. The detected bit, as you can see, it's the tip of the iceberg, the usual phrase. However, once we know where it is, we can do something about it. As I've said, we can look at counter fraud strategies. We can effectively manage those fraud risks and look at that prevention agenda to put things in place to make sure it's not happening going forward. On the other side of the slide, you'll see some published figures around our education sector. And you'll see from those, again, back just from a comparison, 1920 and 2021. These figures are from the fraud landscape report that government produce. And you'll see what I wanted to show there was a 25.9 million increase in the space of them 2 years, which again was around the pandemic, of course. But what's not on screen is the ESFA figures. In 21-22, the ESFA alone detected fraud and error of 64.8 million. And then last year we detected 88.5 million. Again, staggering amounts of money. It's showing the theme that fraud is a problem, and that increase on year is happening. I then ask myself, is it because we're getting better at countering fraud? Is it that we're finding more because we're putting more resource into tackling the problem, that the government's acknowledging this problem? Or are we just lucky? Or is it actually more fraud happening? Could it be a combination of some of those reasons? And I think, though, put them questions to one side, I think the main question is still, are we doing enough? And we're not, and we need to do more. Again, just think what that money could be used for, what you could do with it in your organisations. The pandemic, post-pandemic, Brexit, the war in Ukraine, I've mentioned the cost of living crisis, are all playing a real part in the increase in landscape, the increase in fraud risks, our emerging risks, our internal threat. And as I've mentioned, we've certainly over the last 4 years, not just only seen more fraud, but we've seen more opportunist fraudsters. So people who probably wouldn't have committed fraud in the past, committing more fraud. So the next slide, I've talked a little bit about the importance of countering fraud. What is fraud? Those factors why people commit fraud, and the costs and the staggering amounts of money that it costs us as the public sector and in the education sector as well. And probably no surprise at the ESFA, we pay out approximately £68 billion worth of money. And therefore, we've acknowledged that fraud is a problem. We've acknowledged that we want to do something about it. And fraud sits on our strategic risk. It sits on our agency risk register. And what we're doing as part of our efforts to reduce the impact on fraud and error, we went live with a new counter-fraud corruption strategy in April this year. And this slide gives us a brief summary of the intention of what we want to do and how we want to work with the sector. The strategy was designed to help us achieve some of them aims and missions and goals that I showed on a previous slide. It's a 23 to 26 3-year strategy. The strategy has metrics and measures and to help us measure those successes. It has a delivery plan, of course, that sits behind it to achieve those objectives and goals. And the main purpose is designed to safeguard public funds. It wants to ensure taxpayers' money, as it says on screen, is used for its intended purpose, and that every pound spent on education and skills has that greatest possible impact to ensure all learners can realise their potential. So I think going back to the ESFA and our journey over the last 15 months, that evaluation of the team and what our next part of the journey wants to be, we felt as though we wanted to do a little more than previous strategies and wanted to do more to support the sector, hence being here today as well. I had listened to Working Group 1 and then other stakeholders, and we do believe as an agency that this strategy does set out that intention. It does set out the intention to increase our support. It does set out to help you take proactive steps to protect yourself. Hopefully you can use this strategy as well as some of the other guidance that we're going to look at over the years to help support you, and we're really keen to work more closely with yourself. The pillars of the strategy are on screen, which I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail next. But those pillars really do drive our mission and that vision. What we want is for the strategy to help really build a culture where everyone's responsibility it is to reduce fraud, and that finding fraud is a good thing. In order to fight it, we need to find it, something that you've heard us say already. And you'll see our logo there at the top of the screen. And what we've got there is we've got the school, the academy sitting on top with the prevent, detect, deter pillars, with the pound that we want to protect, with our foundation that runs underneath and holds up those pillars. And really, ultimately, we want to protect the agency, we want to protect the sector, we want to protect yourselves and protect that public purse. So the next slide. This shows the first pillar of the strategy that I've mentioned, and you've heard me mention this a little bit already, which is prevent. I've said if anything today takes something away would be prevention, and prevent should be everyone's first line of defence when it comes to fraud. You know, putting your resources into that, I would probably say if limited resources that we do have would be the key area. I've mentioned prevention is cheaper than investigation. Prevention is better for our reputation, is better for your reputation, and helps prevent reputational damage. Each pillar within the strategy has some key objectives, some of them on screen, which help with our aims and metrics and measure that success I mentioned. And some of them is going to be our offer from the agency and that promise I'm going to mention a little bit further on. I've touched, maybe never said the words, but I've touched raising the profile, making counter fraud everyone's responsibility. And I think to do that, you need to have a strong anti-fraud culture. You need to raise that awareness. You need to do annual training, bespoke training of possibly where you're finding high risks, where you're seeing some of them red risks, where you're seeing some of the emerging frauds coming. Are you horizon scanning? Do you know? How do you find that out? Do you share information with your peers, with the trusts and other academies across the sector? I think one of the areas in prevent is control. You know, always look at controls. Yes, you have standards, audits and everything else, but are your controls and measures that are in place, do they prevent fraud? Do they minimise the opportunity? Think of that fraud triangle I've just been talking about. Is it minimising that opportunity on the fraud triangle? One of the other areas which I can't stress enough under prevent is fraud management, is an effective fraud management cycle. So fraud risk. Do you understand your fraud risks? Do you know what the fraud risks are? Do you know what you're doing about those? I've seen many people who say they do and they say I've got a fraud risk register here, but when talk to them about the fraud risk register, it's just sitting on the shelf and it's not monitored, it's not managed, it's not embedded, you know, and they've asked us how we can overcome that, and I've suggested, is it possible with resource that somebody oversees that, whether it be part of your governance structures or whether you had a fraud champion or somebody who could come along and assist. You'll see one of the, on the right hand side there, one of the words is in bold, which is raise awareness with providers through external comms, engagement, development on our gov.uk, and hopefully some of the words will be standing out in the next couple of slides as well. And this is our promise to you, which is what I'm going to summarise at the end. The next slide is detect. To have an effective counter fraud response, you do need to detect fraud. I think what I say on this one is you've always got to accept there's going to be fraud no matter what. It's not a failure if you find fraud. As I've said, it's actually a good thing. You might not think it at the time because of the cost, because of the impact it has, that reputational damage that it brings. But ask yourself, what if you hadn't detected it? Would the fraud have just continued under that waterline, thinking about the iceberg? You wouldn't have been aware of it, that hidden crime, and it continued and money embezzled out of your organisation. Or you may detect it further down the line and therefore it has a much larger impact, be it financial or reputation. I think under detect, one of the key messages, collaboration. Collaboration for me is powerful. Data is powerful. There's more and more we can now do with data. We at the agency have lots of data, and what we're looking at under our strategy, which hopefully will help the sector as well, we want to turn some of that data we hold into what we call intelligence data and actually do something with it. You know, I think detect will be invaluable when it comes to data as well as prevention, of course. And a challenge, can you do anything? You know, do you have data in one part of your business that might help in another part? Do you know what your data tells you? Might that data flag something up? Might it flag up a suspicion or a risk? Or might it even show fraud? I mentioned the fraud iceberg and some of them staggering amounts that it costs the public sector and the ESFA. What we do is we collect data quarterly and we report on that data, which helps kind of show our fraud landscape. And what we're doing is we're looking at the trends and analysis of what that data is telling us, and more importantly, what we can do, that continuous improvement, that lesson learned. And this way, I think one of my messages across to yourselves today is, this is where I want you to encourage yourselves, the sector, to make sure you're reporting everything to us. You know, what we need to do, we need to fully understand what the problem is. We need to fully understand what that fraud landscape is of the sector. If we don't know, then we can't do anything about it. Or we may design tools, or we think we know what the problem is and design things that maybe won't suit everybody. But what we will do and what we're committed to do is we'll continue to publicise our investigation reports, which go on our website. And I hope you look at those and you use those to help detect fraud and protect yourselves, making you aware of the risks and what we find into to help with that vigilance. So the next slide and the final pillar. So this is our redress. This is Deter. I'm a big believer, working in the counter fraud kind of fraud role for 28 years. To make a difference, we need to hit the fraudsters in the pocket if we can. We need to recover the losses. We need to apply sanctions. We need to prosecute people. We need to put that money back into the sector, into the education. You know, we look at disqualifying people. We flag people on high risks to prevent us paying funding to them going forward and working with the agency. What I do get here, and I understand it's not always possible to get the money back, you know, as it's money that is there for the academy, for the school, for the children, for the learners. So we do have to take a bit of a balanced view here. And this is where at times you may feel as though we do pass information back to the sector or back to the schools and the providers and the academies, asking you to take action yourselves and report to the police. And the reason we do that is because you're the victim. You are the ones who've suffered that at times, and therefore you can look with the police to put a victim impact assessment, look at the proceeds of crime. That gives us the powers to hopefully get that money back and give it back to yourselves. We've had cases that I'm aware of where we've done that, and the police have picked up cases and did the prosecution, and they've frozen people's private pensions, occupational pensions, and then frozen that, and then under the proceeds of crime they've been able to take amount of the pension that a person would have had to pay back to the school and back to the academy, and using that proceeds of crime and giving the money back to the victim, to the school, so therefore back to the learners and the children. I think under Deter, this is where we want to look at developing tools, make people aware of those tools. And this is something I see in years 2 and 3 of the strategy, and really keen for feedback, really keen to get more feedback from yourselves and from the rest of the sector of what we can do here. If you think back to that 10-80-10 rule, let's try and change that behaviour of that 80%, and let's work on that 10%. You know, how can we increase that capability and capacity? So prevent, detect, deter are our pillars, and I'm hoping that should give you, if you follow that, or if you want to follow our strategy, it should give you a good approach to help tackle fraud. Those pillars have been around the counter fraud world for a long time, but they do work. I think depending on your maturity as an organisation, I've also worked with 2 other pillars, one being governance and the other one being acknowledge. And these are probably, I would say, more important when you're starting out on your counter fraud journey. As I think we'd all acknowledge, it's imperative that we have good governance. And if you don't acknowledge fraud as a problem, then the problem's not going to go away. So we need to acknowledge that it is a problem and that you want to do something about it. I do see people say that there's still now that there's no fraud. I do see people say that there's very little fraud. And it's come back at a later date, and they've, you know, we've had conversations and said, well, actually, Stephen, I wish I'd listened. There is fraud, and I wish we'd looked to what we could have done to acknowledge the problem and do something about it. So the next slide. So what are we doing different? I'm hoping this explains a little bit of that, although I appreciate it's a one slider. But this is the foundation I mentioned earlier. This holds up those pillars. It holds up the sector. It holds up the school, the academy. This is the protect. You know, for me, if we don't protect the sector from fraud, then the school, the academy, the trust, it'll fail. It'll fail in many ways. Protect is something I'm really passionate about. We need to protect the ESFA and the ESFA's assets, but we also need to protect yourselves and the sector, protect the learners, protect the children, protect that public purse. Things we're going to do that, we will work with our policy teams, we'll work with the DFE more closely and look at the delivery aspects of what's going on and the funding. We'll look at our cybersecurity colleagues and work with those to see what we can do in the cybersecurity, in the cyber fraud world, where cyber fraud go hand in hand. As well as we'll look at other stakeholders and providers and see what we can do to look at best practice and listen to yourselves to what's out there. To protect the sector, this is where there's a commitment to want to upskill yourselves. We want to increase our offer to support yourselves. We want to provide more awareness. We want to provide those tools, and really keen for your feedback to understand what we can do more in this space. Again, for me, if you're protecting yourselves, then ultimately we're protecting the ESFA, and we do all share that common goal, which is to protect that money, ensure that that pound is spent for the children, for the learners, and kept in the education sector. You know, and I think what I wanted to show here, that foundation is something that I wanted the strategy to really drive us forward, have that real impact, and something that can pull us together as one sector when it comes to our fight against fraud. So that's a very brief summary of the strategy, and hopefully it's something, as I said, hopefully it's something that you can use, but really also keen for year 2 and 3 of the strategy for people to reach out and help us drive that next chapter of the strategy over the years 2 and 3. So moving on to the next slide. What is the current picture? What is that current fraud landscape? I've talked about fraud quite a bit there, but what do we see? As I mentioned, we do record information quarterly, so we've pulled this together with a little bit of lead-in time. I haven't got Q1 figures for 2023-24, so this is last year's. But during that time, as you can see, we received 47 allegations of fraud, be it that through whistleblowing or internal. We only received 53 self-reported cases direct from yourselves, from the sector, from the academies under the Academies and Trust Handbook, which surprises us. I would expect to see more, and a plea today would be, please report more to us if you're seeing fraud. You know, we can't do anything about it unless they are being reported to us. But looking at the infographic on the left hand side, and out of those 100 cases, we've broke them down into some terminology typologies of what we saw. And starting at the top, theft, probably no surprise. We continue to see theft in schools, theft in academies, theft of private school funds, theft of assets, which links into abusive position, where we're seeing people hiring family members, not going through the correct procurement and procedure rules, using school premises still for personal use, people using private school funds for things which like alcohol still, and Domino's pizzas for a staff for every month, and things like that. Some argue, is that fraud, or is it just abusive position and use of funds? We have seen on the fraud side of things though, where people's been claiming expenses, people's been going off to spas and using the private school funds and other school funds, petty cash and so forth to pay for spa treatments, and using procurement cards, school procurement cards for a personal gain. So buying things really for their home and so forth. We saw falsification of documents last year, so exaggerating overtime, as I said, expenses claims. We've seen exaggerated pupil numbers to get more funding from the agency. There was 8 years I've worked in the counter-fraud investigation profession, although things have changed now more into the cyber world, but the mandate fraud, impersonation fraud, it's been going on for years, but victims still fall for it. We've got the CEO fraud, where the CEO, an email will come in pretending to be from the chief officer or the head teacher, saying that they need the money paying now because they're out somewhere, and people are still paying it and still falling for it. We see contractor and third-party fraud. This is where that corruption and bribery that I mentioned previously more sits in, where people getting backhanders for bringing in friends and families and people they know. This is where we see some ghost contractors, where actually we're paying and it's not a real contractor or a real supplier, and money going out there. Linking back to falsification of documents, we get there's a link in with falsification of documents to contractors and suppliers, linking it to invoice fraud, linking it to procurement fraud as well. Probably no surprise, cybercrime is on screen, and there's a little section there at the bottom on cybercrime. We do see that and continue to see big cases of cybercrime, and if you think about the 100, 25% of that is cybercrime reported to us in 22-23. And what I will say about cybercrime, it can have serious financial and reputational consequences and damage. You know, cyber security, I can't stress enough, is really important. Being on top of that, getting the guidance and the help that's out there, and the support that's available. There are examples of some mature trusts, which you probably know of, who've been hit by cyber attacks. And talking to some of those trusts, myself, and just recently over the last couple of months, we had a conversation with one of those big, large, mature trusts, and they were hit a few years back by a cyber attack, and they're still feeling the impact of it now. It's still continuing, like years on, so can't stress enough on that one. Procurement has been an emergent fraud since the pandemic. It's been an increase with a lot of things for a lot of government departments, not just in our sector. We see in pre-contract stage procurement where there's what you call bid rigging, where companies are colluding to come up and inflate costs to agree who's going to put in the lowest cost, although they've agreed it between them to inflate the cost. So it's actually not really, it's not a lower amount, it's a higher amount. And company A will win the contract over with one school academy, and company B will win the other one over in another one, but they've got together, they've colluded, they've inflated the costs out there as well. This is where we see that invoice kind of fraud coming in as well on procurement. So is it a false invoice? Has somebody been on your website? Has somebody been able to, with the transparency agenda that we have now, you know, and the information that we disclose and the information that's on our website, there is fraudsters out there who are actively looking on your website, who are actively looking for information and data that you hold to then create false invoices and so forth, to look to exploit those times. What I would say in this, a lot of fraud isn't in isolation. As I spoke here, as you can tell, I talked about frauds going hand in hand, and we tend to be, when we investigate it, it is that holistic investigation into multiple frauds. But what I will say, they do share a common theme when we've looked at the lessons learned, and a lot of it unfortunately is around poor governance, which is probably a precursor for potential fraud and irregularity as well. So the next slide, I'm hoping and expect this slide isn't really needed, but I don't think it would be a presentation talking to the academy sector without having something around the Academy Trust Handbook. So this slide shows yourselves in a summary of what the Academy Trust Handbook says around fraud, theft, irregularity and cybercrime. The musts that are bold on screen are linked to what I've been saying, and the messages about reporting fraud to us, that intelligence, that data that we can then look at, that's self-reported, you know, those whistleblowing allegations and what we can do about it. The 53 last year, again, I think is on the low side, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But me kind of plea on this one is, please report. It is important. We do want to help you. If you do report, then it gives us that picture, that landscape. It gives us that true picture to be able to go away and look to see what we can do to support you further. I've been working with the Academy's Trust Handbook colleagues with the simplification agenda, when we did consider whether the 5,000 could go up to 10,000, which it's come from the sector. I hope you agree from listening today and what I've said, that we decided it was, in my view and other views, that it was best to leave it as it was and leave the lower amount or the same amount that we used to, so we can get that information into us and get it reported. There was a conversation whether it should just go to zero, but again, some of the sector didn't feel as though it was more of a backward step, so we've left it as it was. So on to me, next slide. So what can you do? I think this slide for me has a lot of common sense. It's things that I hope and would expect you have in place. But what I will say, working in that counter fraud profession for 28 years, I do still see the same frauds as I did many years ago. I do see people not acknowledging what I've mentioned, that fraud is a problem, until it's too late. The governance, the poor governance I've mentioned, you know, had we had good governance, or it may have stopped or minimised that fraud risk. The ESFA strategy, the policy, the response plan, the other counter fraud measures and plans that we do have do go a long way, and could be things that you could do to help you. But for me, again, that's not enough. You really need to embed that anti-fraud culture. I mentioned annual awareness. Can you include fraud as a risk at induction level? Can you talk to new members of staff and explain some of them controls and measures that you have in place? When people leave, is it an automatically as part of your exit strategy? Is access being revoked? So they still haven't got access to things and so forth. I think acknowledging the risk, but more as well as understanding your risk, that fraud risk assessment that I've said again, can't stress enough. Do you do fraud risk assessments? Do you have fraud as a high risk in your risk registers? You may not have the capacity and resource to do that. So at least, is fraud part of your overall risk management and discussed under your governance arrangement? As I said before, could you have that fraud champion? Is there that oversight and scrutiny as well? I've mentioned, and it goes without saying, internal controls, whether that be segregation of duties. Do you verify before you pay? Do you check those invoices? Do you check those change in bank account requests? Do you check, are they original, are they legit? Do you have asset registers? Again, we come across cases where some of this is not there and not happening, but are controls that we all should have in place, and I hope you do. The famous saying, trust is no control. Unfortunately, this is true, and we see many of cases where people have worked with people for many years, work alongside them, trust them, socialize with them outside of work, and don't believe that that person would commit fraud. But think of this fraud triangle. It does happen, and it can have real impacts, not just on the victim, not just on the school, but on the wider ripple effect as well. Cybersecurity, again, no surprises on there, but whistleblowing. Do you have a whistleblowing policy? Again, can't stress enough, an effective whistleblowing policy is really key, and make sure it's not just a tick in the box. There's some excellent advice out there under Protect, which is the whistleblowing charity. If you don't know about them, have a look on their website, and they do provide some great advice and information. Can fraud training be included in plans? That fraud champion I mentioned, can they oversee and help drive some of this? There is lots of good advice out there. Can we help more as a sector? Can we help more as the agency? I've put a link on the screen there for Take 5. I believe that's Take 5 from the police has just recently updated some of their advice and guidance, and it's always, like I say, good to keep looking out there what there is. I think one thing we're not so good at, albeit we are getting better, is sharing the lessons learned. I think talking about if we've been a victim of fraud, or if we've had that cyber attack, or what's happened. I think the reason for that is that we see it as a failure and potentially something's gone wrong, and it's the reputation. And do we really want to tell other people? But can we get over that? Is it not more about making sure it doesn't happen again, and telling other people so it doesn't happen again in their areas and their businesses? So we're all there as a sector fighting that fraud together, protecting ourselves, so that ultimately we can put that funding back in to the children, the learners in the sector, because ultimately we're here for the same purpose. A couple of little tips. If it's too good to be true, it probably will be. I only got caught last year myself, and I worked in fraud 28 years, and I ordered something last year. Thought, wow, that's brilliant. It was too good to be true. The goods never came. And I would quite like to think I'm quite vigilant in this, so it does happen, and that's why it does happen. So it is the famous saying. Be careful, I suppose, at the end of term time, that busy time, fraudsters do try to exploit that pressure, that opportunity that there is around a little bit more, thinking of the triangle. I can't stress enough about being vigilant. Does somebody want that money now? If they do, is it really genuine? If they want it now, is the fraudster trying to push you, to try and give you pressure to make that payment? I would think as a manager or a senior person would prefer the cautious approach than to lose money at Take 5. Common sense, but checking spelling, grammar, go with your gut. I've seen numerous documentation, invoices around the mandate fraud. Some really poor invoices come in and people have still paid. Bank account request changes. We saw a little while back where the fraudster is getting in touch with organisations well in advance to advise them that they've changed the telephone number. So when we come to change that bank account over, one of our controls may be to phone the company and just say, oh, it's just Stephen here from ABC, and I just want to check to see, have you sent this in to us to change the bank account? And because they are phoning the fraudster's new number and not the legitimate company, then of course they're saying yes, and then it's changed. The money's gone out the door, then it's too late. The fraudsters will move the money quickly off into another account. I think internally there's red flags. You know, I can probably fit myself into some of this, working alone, staying alert, reluctant for others to take on duties, you know, taking leave. Sudden change in character though and coming into money could be red flags of an internal threat, an internal fraud, but again could just be not as well. I think one last bullet point here is on the bottom, is really keen to come and talk to us. I said earlier, this is the start. We've started to listen, but I haven't, and the team haven't had the opportunity to do that even further. So really keen. That's why we're here today, to do more. Which brings me on to my final slide. And I've called this kind of page our promise, and it's a promise today, what we are going to do. We've got a measure in our new strategy, which is to increase our offer to the sector by 10% each year of the 3-year strategy, and that's what we intend to do. If we can do more, we will. So what we're going to do in that, you know, we're going to, as it says on screen, that what we're going to lead the fraud communication and continue that stakeholder engagement. I want to raise that awareness and try and get the anti-fraud culture that fraud is everyone's responsibility. You know, coming along to these events, offering advice and guidance. We're going to update our gov.uk page. At the moment, the gov.uk page isn't very user-friendly on the fraud side. It's hard to find how to report fraud, how to get that advice and guidance. And we're hopefully going to be launching soon with a new gov.uk page, which will be a direct page into counter fraud and prevention, and it'll give you them alerts, it'll tell you advice, it'll have documents, it'll give you that information to get in touch with us or to report fraud and make it a lot easier. The collaboration side of it, we're going to continue to do that. I want to do more of that. We're going to continue to work with Working Group 1. And what we're doing with the Working Group 1 in the academies is we're going to share information, fraud risks, emerging risks. We want to look at what's best practice out there and then get that out to the rest of the sector. Produce some clear guidelines, making sure that reporting lines are clear. And I mentioned before about cyber attacks and some big some large trusts out there who's been hit. We're going to hopefully be going live with a couple of case studies to really show that real impact that it is. But lastly, before I finish and move on to questions, if there's anything more we can do, happy for people to reach out, give that feedback. I am mindful that it's a complex and large sector. It's not just the academies that we're here to support as well. So I'm mindful to manage the sector's expectation. But I hope this is a start. I hope you welcome this and us reaching out, and hopefully you've taken something away today. The team and I are certainly passionate about this. We want to do more in the sector to counter fraud and make that real difference, that real impact. Our generic email is on the bottom there as well. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you found it was useful and informative, and at least taken one thing away today. And I will stop there and over to questions if there is.
Okay, so if there's no questions, there's some in the chat, I think, Stephen. So I don't know whether to go through them.
Yeah, I'll have a look at the most liked then and just see what we're going down. There's a one in anonymous one about would be really useful. So it's more of a, rather than a question, just more of an observation for an annual fraud report to be done and shared with schools. Again, there is a lot of information out there from central government, but maybe it's not so much in the sector. We do, our annual report and accounts does have information about fraud, and it does publish some fraud figures and things in there. So again, we do that annually, of course, but it is something that we could maybe look at to see if there's any more to get their messages out there. So large increase in error rate attributed to all I can go off is last year here. Just recently, we've had some large error rates from the assurance and audit colleagues and the work that they've been doing around free school meals. And we're doing a bit of an exercise at the minute to look at the reasoning behind that and what we can do in if there's any fraud in there and so forth. So there's that side of it. In bursaries as well. There's information came out of bursaries which may not just be for this sector, but there's information on the error that came out from bursaries, and we having a little bit of focus at the moment to kind of drill down into the bursaries and have a look to see what we can do. Again, comments in about phishing attempts and reporting. Again, we'll take those away and have a look to see if there's an easier way to report some of them. No problem. Again, more comments in around there's a fraud uncovered at one of the schools that you self-reported and that the ESFA were fair and demonstrated what steps they've taken. It's good to hear. Again, that's what we want. We want to be here to support and help. Working Group 1, apologies, is Working Group 1 is in the academies sector. There is a governance structure, and in the governance structure there's an academies board, and from the board which is made up of the sector representatives from across the academy sector, and from that there's some working groups, and the working groups have specific kind of topics and work streams, and Working Group 1 has a few, but one of them is counter fraud. So I go along to Working Group 1 4 times a year and talk with the sector. It's chaired by the sector. All the members are from the sector. We do go along, me and a couple of colleagues from the ESFA, and this is where I feed into what we're seeing, what the alerts are, what can we do, and these are feeding back, I would hope, information from the sector to us so we can look at what we're doing and how we can help support you further. I appreciate it might not be covering every part and everything else, so really keen if there's anything else we can do to get that wider information, we can have a look at that. But that's what Working Group 1 is. I'm sure we might be able to circulate who the chair of Working Group 1 is and information, and I think it's believed that there should be a representative from different regions and from different parts of the academy sector as well, different maturities and so forth. Slides will be, yeah. Again, some more comments around being useful for the trust as a wider community and so forth. Then, yeah, great. We'll take them comments away. Some great feedback. I think I've just seen one pop up and then it disappeared on the bank account one and the mandate fraud one and so forth. I don't know if it's been answered or not by any of the team. But again, fraudsters, the organised criminals, are looking and exploiting everything that we do, and actually some of them's ahead of us. At times they do this for a living and things. So I think getting contact details and names of people and everything else, and having that contract management kind of element is the key for me. That do you know the person? Do you know the supplier, the contractor? Can you speak with them? Can you? One of the key ones that we have said is, can you do a Teams call now? Could you get them on Teams to confirm? Could you do that Zoom call? So you're actually seeing who they are and things. Again, maybe it's not ideal for everybody, but it's just the fraudsters are getting. We've seen one who had got in over 18 months ago. Had gone in and changed the bank account. Now I don't know why that hasn't been picked up in the 18 months, but it was done 18 months ago. We tend to see ones in the last 3 to 6 months as the norm, where they're going in to change the bank accounts and then coming in a bit, not too long later to do the bank account change. but it is the personal relationships and the contract management, and Zoom and the new ways of technology, I guess, is things that are suggested to a couple of trusts just recently. Given the number of academies in the country, does the amount of reported fraud seem unexpectedly low? I believe so, yes, and I think hopefully that's come across in me ask today about, are we actually seeing everything? Are we getting everything reported? And if there's more we can do in that one, you know, there's again that managing expectations, as I mentioned. But yes, please report, and once we know more, we can report more and do something about it. Cybercrime again, and expert specialists again, we can come back to work with some of our cyber colleagues in the National Cyber Security Centre that we work with in alerts, and see if we can provide some expert advice on that one. We'll take that one offline and come back. Again, so further comments regarding feedback, I will take them away. Is there any last main comment anywhere? I'll take the last question. I appreciate time is running on. I think the last one I'll take is around presentation, training material to share and so forth. On that one, this is exactly the feedback we're wanting, and under that upskilling element, and in years 2 and 3 is like, what is it that we can do to help, and you know, with the gov.uk and some of the key messages we want to get out there, is that the answer, or is there other things we can do? But that's the feedback we want to be able to look to see, can we get some of our material, because we do have training material, we do have presentations, we do have, you know, depending on the, you know, the individual, we have more bespoke training, more detailed training to more general training. So we'll take that away, and certainly something we can look to build and help support you in that as well. I'd love to keep answering questions, but I'll cut me short there and hand back to Natalie. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Stephen, for an excellent presentation. That was really informative. So if we move on to the link to the survey that I mentioned earlier, should now be in the chat. And while you're completing that, I want to let you know about the power hours that are coming up. The next event will be about financial simplification and the revisions to the Academy Trust Handbook. And this will be delivered on Wednesday, the 19th of July at 3 p.m. We also have another power hour on Wednesday, the 2nd of August at 11 a.m. about related party transactions. So thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you at the next power hour events. Thank you.